this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Hollis. For this episode, I've made a field trip to the Green Howards Regimental Museum in Richmond, in Yorkshire. The Green Howards landed in the first wave on D-Day, and with them was Company Sergeant Major Stan Hollis, who had seen action in France in 1940, being evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk. He fought in North Africa and took part in the invasion of Sicily. It's fair to say Hollis was a seasoned soldier. Stan Hollis is also the only recipient of the Victoria Cross for his actions on the 6th of June. Steve Erskine joins me to discuss Hollis and the Green Howards on D-Day. Thanks for inviting me to the museum, Steve. So let's start with the Green Howards. My grandfather, great-grandfather and great-uncle all served with the regiment. Looking on Wikipedia, I notice that the oldest continual serving regiment in the British Army is the Coldstream Guards, which was raised in 1650. Now, the Green Howards are not that far behind, raised in the 1680s. Does the regiment have a illustrious history? Why the Green Howards?
The regiment is created, as you say, in 1688, part of that thing I was taught at school, the Glorious Revolution, what we would today, I suppose, call a first example of regime change.
Yeah.
So a local landowner, Francis Luttrell, at Luttrell Castle, just outside Exeter, he sees the way that the wind is blowing and raises a regiment to support the claim of William of Orange. And consequently, that is the real root of what becomes the Yorkshire Regiment, the 19th Regiment of Foot and the Green Howards. So they're created in that space there. And as a man from County Durham, it pleases me no end to tell the good people of Yorkshire that their beloved Yorkshire Regiment was raised in Somerset. So that pleases me. But again, it goes to show you that whole mix and match of antecedents that all regiments can point to, because they're pulling in different bits of different organisations. Fast forward a little to 1740s, War of Austrian Succession, and the regiments are then named after their colonels. So this is Howard's Regiment. And at a particular engagement, the Commander-in-Chief asks Howard to move his regiment, and two men stand up and move forward. What are you two doing? Well, I'm called Howard, and so is he. We need to find a way of distinguishing one from the other. You have green facings on the front of your uniforms. You're the Green Howards. You have yellow facings on yours. You're the Buff Howards. There's nothing more sexy than a simple way of identifying one regiment from another on the battlefield. And that name stuck until it was then the War Office get fed up of the changes of names. So they then rank them by number. And we become the 19th Senior Regiment of Foot until we become Alexander, Princess of Wales' own Yorkshire Regiment, and then eventually the Green Howards, and become the Royal Yorkshire Regiment, I should say now, since the accession of King Charles.
What's the connection with Denmark? There's this weird thing, I didn't realise the colonels keep being Danish. I'm like, wow, I didn't know that.
Norwegian.
Was it Norwegian?
Yeah. So in 1875, Alexander of such the name, the Princess of Wales, she presents the new colour and agrees to become the Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment.
Right.
When she dies, her son, who has now become the king of an independent Norway, because Norway was part of Denmark at that point, he takes on that title. So the royal family of Norway, up until amalgamation, were always the Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment. And in fact, we're sitting here in the Green Howards Museum, and this was opened 50 years ago this year, by King Olaf of Norway.
That's brilliant, isn't it? Well-known Yorkshireman, King Olaf of Norway.
Absolutely. He did a great thing. Someone told me a story. They had a battlefield tour because the 1st Battalion were at Orta in 1940, and they went to look at this, and somebody from the British Embassy met them and was talking about their plans, and they were saying, oh yes, we're getting the train up north tomorrow. And the next morning, as they were getting all their gear to go on the minibus, he turned up again and he said, you're not getting the train. The King's given you a fat Albert, a good old Hercules. You'll go like that.
So how did they end up in Richmond? And this is Richmond, Yorkshire,
yes.
Not Surrey.
Not Surrey.
Why you? Because I think it always strikes me as an odd place to put somewhere, does Richmond, because it's not flat, it's halfway up the hill. You'd have thought maybe protecting the Vale of York.
Yeah.
from the Scots, somewhere lower down, maybe one of the key arterial routes.
This is another one of those. I'd love to give you a really interesting, complicated an explanation. But the story goes, it could be apocryphal. The colonel at that time was asked, where is your natural recruiting ground? And he had absolutely no idea. But he'd heard someone talking about Yorkshire and he plumped for that. And the War Office said, right, 1872, I think this was, right, as part of the military reforms where geographical identities are
Cardwell?
Yeah, you're Yorkshire. And here we are.
Plumped him in Richmond.
Yeah, but again, another fluke of history.
It's odd, isn't it?
It is. These little odd things that end up determining such an incredible identity and rooting a story so much in a place.
Because it could well be, Northallerton's a county town, but it's not a Northallerton. Yeah. Why not York?
Yeah, exactly.
Why not, Middlesbrough? But you take quite a small market town in the foothills of the Dales and plonk the regiment there, and it always slightly baffled me.
And again, so many round here, because we're so close to the Durham Light Infantry, we're so close to the Northumberland Fusiliers, you often get people coming in here, for instance, and saying, my grandfather was from Richmond, he must have been in the Green Howards. Not necessarily.
That gets us to Stan Hollis. We're going to be vaguely talking about Stan Hollis, who is a Green Howard.
He is indeed.
But he's not from Richmond. Yep. So what's his background? Is he from a stoically military family?
No, he's from Middlesbrough. Born in 1912. I think his father served with the Yorkshire Regiment in the First World War. Yeah. So there is that familial connection. Stan himself went to sea, served in the Merchant Navy, was a mechanic. He did all sorts of different things, which with hindsight preps him to be the brilliant NCO that the British Army needs and depends on. He becomes a self-reliant problem solver.
Yes.
Through all of the things that he does. His parents moved to the coast, to Robin Hood's Bay in the 1920s, and it's from there that Stan then went to sea. He became quite ill, blackwater fever, etc. Came home. At that point, he enlisted into the then TA in the 4th Battalion, which is again Middlesbrough based. And then when war is declared, he's transferred to the 6th Battalion and serves with them over in France.
One might say the Green Howards are unfortunate as they seem to get a lot of service. Yes. But how is his service with the Green Howards or even the Green Howards in France? I don't know how much we know specifically about what he was doing with the BEF in.
So 4th and 5th Battalion, 6th and 7th are there, but 4th and 5th Battalion are the ones that get much of the focus. But obviously Stan is 6th. But so they're sent to the, in inverted commas, front line as part of that phony war. And then on the 10th of May, the Germans break through and it's just headlong retreat back to the coastline. And they're doing that rear guard, go to this village, dig in. When they get there, it's already fallen, etc. It's that confusion. Much like the Kaiserschlacht of 1918. Very similar stories there if you read the accounts. And Stan gets back to Bray Dunes at Dunkirk and swims out to a ship and is brought back. I mean, it's a typical story, in a terrible way. It's no different, Stan's war there than a multitude of other people's.
Well, it's my great uncle was the same. He's TA somewhere at Thirsk and then gets sent with the BEF and comes out from Dunkirk. We know nothing else about him other than that. But then this is where the Green Howards, they get split. My great uncle gets sent, I think, to India and Burma. Yeah. But Stan's with the lot that goes to...
Stan stays with the 6th. He then off to Africa. Yep. North Africa, Western Desert, etc. Fights all the way through the Western Desert campaign.
Now, I've got this from talking to Paul Chill, because Paul Chill's, whose father is Bill Chill, who wrote the memoir. He got sent out later, but they had quite a sticky time, hadn't they?
It's all relative terms, but it's not so bad for the 6th and 7th. The 4th and 5th are absolutely decimated, to the point that when the survivors come back, neither battalion is reconstituted. They drop off the order of battle completely. So they're right through the desert campaign. Stan is wounded in the desert first, his first wound there, and then goes over. They're then prepped over to Sicily. Fights all the way up the east coast, from Avola right up to Taormina in the north. He's again wounded there. They come home in November 1943.
At this point, he's working his way up through the ranks.
He has. He's become company sergeant major now. Again, the British Army, I think, despite maybe public perception is very good at recognising what I described earlier on. Whether it's an officer thinking, well, I don't want to do the work, this man will. He's more than capable of doing it. And I don't think that's the case. But he's a very capable NCO that has that wonderful ability to be respected by men who are serving under him and men who he is serving above him.
He's an older soldier as well at this point.
He is, yeah. He's an older man, so he's a bit sort of granddad to an awful lot of young lads.
Gives you a certain level of authority.
He does, yeah. And again, he's been through a number of things up to this point that give him the right to speak and to be listened to.
After Sicily, they're Montgomery requests.
Yeah, so they come back and they're originally assigned as second wave, 6th and 7th Battalion.
For Overlord.
Yeah, for Overlord. And it's only in February 1944 that they're actually told, well, no, you're going in first. They get back from Sicily in November 1943, and in February they're told, well, actually, you're going in first. So they're up in Scotland doing combined ops training. If you look at Sicily, we've never done a landing on that scale against an opposed shoreline, okay? You can't count Torch, you can't count Dieppe. The things that we learned, we've now got to put in place for what is undoubtedly going to be a much tougher nut to crack. And then at the last minute, you're saying, well, we're going to change the role from these guys are now going to be that first punch. Add into that you have, as a consequence of the desert and Sicily, malaria is a big problem. So there is mepicrine tablets that are used to suppress this. Get back in November 43. In January 44, they withdraw the mepicrine. And an awful lot of guys, and this happens, I think, 3 days before they actually depart for the invasion, company commanders and platoon commanders are dropping all over the place. Experienced men are being lost in preparation for this entire campaign. Arguably the most historic part of the Second World War.
It is, but I'm sure from their point of view, they probably felt they've had enough.
Absolutely, I'm sure they did. But again, you've got this, we mentioned it before we switched on the microphones, this identity of the regiment. But they're taking men from all over the place in different regiments, and they're, in the modern terminology, being rebadged. You know, there's a fascinating question there, maybe a PhD for somebody, to think about how that watering of the identity affected operational effectiveness, when not only are these guys from Middlesbrough, who all, not in the sense of the PALS battalions of the First World War, but probably know each other's families or know someone who knows somebody, and suddenly all these Cameronians are coming in, and who the hell are you?
Well, this is where we were saying this before we started, weren't we? Because as a kid growing up, Middlesbrough wasn't part of Yorkshire, so to me the Yorkshire Regiment was the Vale of York, the Moors and the Dales, and actually it includes Middlesbrough, Loftus, all those industrial areas, and it is from that peacetime identity. I presume there's two identities for the regiment. There's must be a peacetime identity to the regiment, which is made up of a lot of TA units, which are local. Yeah. And then as soon as war breaks out, the TA make it probably quite homogeneous until we get replacements and people can volunteer. And it swells enormously during the First World War. How much did it swell during the Second World War, the regiment?
Probably not numerically, because obviously weaponry has changed and therefore you've got a reduced number of men in a battalion. But yeah, they're pretty comparable in terms. I mean, it's 13 battalions in the First World War. Yeah. What's that? 750 to 1,000 men per battalion. Yeah. And I think we had something like 13 battalions in the Second World War, only 7 of which were operational. But yeah, you do a tour of all of the villages around Middlesbrough, Loftus, Ormsby, and look at the War Memorial, Green Howard. Well, I always find it fascinating looking at war memorials, and actually sometimes, quite often, it is not Green Howard, but in certain areas it suddenly is. In other areas it's quite disparate where people have been, if they even do mention the... And so many, again, I've got one on my desk at the moment where the family are asking for details, and according to his regimental number, he's the Worcester Regiment. But he's serving with the Green Howards when he's wounded, and I can't figure out where he is at the minute. So there's, people are drafted in all the time, attached to.
I have a great grandfather who starts in the Green Howards Pioneers and ends up in the Labour Corps. So he ends up with two service numbers.
And again, you can multiply that by officer at the officer rank. Battalion commanders are not Green Howards. A lot of the company commanders are not Green Howards.
Oh, aren't they really?
No, and if you look at the turnover from Sicily to Normandy, it's quite vast. It's one of the things we're looking at for our exhibition on Normandy in June of 2024, looking at that turnover of men from all sorts of regiments.
Oh, that's interesting. So your officers were just classed as, well, obviously they would have their home regiment, but they were just sent to fill gaps where necessary because there's only so many of them, and you can't bring so many people repeatedly up through the ranks because you still need your cadre of sergeants and everybody else doing the work. I'd never realised that.
Yeah, it's absolutely phenomenal. When I looked at Sicily and I was trying to, map out that structure, and then you look at D-Day, and it just leaps off the page that these names are so different. And these are men who've come in to prep for the biggest seaboard operation ever, and they don't belong to that regiment, and they're coming in at relatively the 11th hour. And again, what must those guys have thought when this newbie walks through the door?
From Cheshire or Worcestershire?
I think there's a company commander from the Queen's. There's a company commander from the Essex Regiment.
And because it's funny, go back to the first one, in my mind, they're all the local aristocracy are marching them. Yeah. You get Hugh Bell's son, the iron magnate, his son's leading them out in the Thallerton during the First World War. You get Bocklau, his son is a major, and they're all the local families are actually.
So they'd know those people from the newspapers, if nothing else. But this is the faraway land of southern England. This guy's come from, and he's talking to. I can't understand a word he says.
I hadn't appreciated that. That's
so. It's a fascinating aspect of this, in terms of how that change did or did not, and we'll come to it, affect the operational effectiveness of a unit and its achievement of its objectives.
There's some questions, PhD questions for corporate culture there as well.
It's one of the joys of working in a museum. My school reports all said, Steve is easily distracted. This is the wrong place to put me, because questions like that crop up and you're just straight down the rabbit hole. It's wonderful.
Let's look at the Green Howards on D-Day. They're in the initial wave. Is it all Saving Private Ryan for them? And Saving Private Ryan is obviously Omaha. Yeah. What's the British beaches like for the Green Howards?
Gold Beach, King Green sector, 6th and 7th Battalion land there, 6th Battalion first, 7th Battalion a few hours later. If I can just go back one stage, because again, I think one of the things that comes through when you're researching this, that people don't really appreciate. So Stan Hollis and the men of the 6th Battalion get off the Empire Lance, they go down the scrambling nets, and they get into their landing craft. Everybody, please don't believe that as soon as you get in the landing craft, you're off to the beach. You've got to wait for the entire battalion or companies to be ready. So for people like Stan, they're in that landing craft going round and round in circles for about an hour and a half before everything's ready and they can all go in together. And even then, they're 7 miles out. So at 4 or 5 knots, it's going to take you a good 3/4 of an hour to get into the beach. Yeah. So can you imagine the condition of those men in a relatively rough sea with their seasickness, their fear, whatever? You just want to get off and walk. Yeah. But they've gone round and round in circles before they've even got there. They're going through that. But as in all of these cases, there's tragedy. We've got Sergeant Rufty Hill, who, if you look at the Green Howards website, there's a piece on him. He's been right through North Africa. He's been right through Sicily. The landing craft comes in. There's constant movement on the seabed of sandbars, which the combined operation pilotage parties are trying to map. So the landing craft hits one of these sandbars, the ramp comes down and Rufty goes off and just drops. Then the wave comes in, lifts the landing craft over the top of him. He hasn't even got to the beach. A man with that experience is lost in a tragedy like that. All of the training has been about the beach. Hastings, the commander of the 6th Battalion, in his post-action report says, we spent way too much time on the big picture stuff. We didn't do internal operation. We didn't do fire and movement. We didn't do platoon and company movement. But if you think about it, everything is on that beach. If you can't get off the beach, there is no invasion. Rommel understood it. We have to give everything there. And it's kind of, when we get ashore, we'll think about it then. But they clear their beach obstacles within something like 49 minutes of the signal goes back to say that Green Howards have captured that section of Gold Beach. So they've taken out machine gun positions, they've taken out those bunkers on the beach, and they're moving inland to attack their main objective, which is the Mount Fleury battery, which has 120, 155mm guns in that can enfilade both the beaches.
So is it coming off the beach that Stan's recommended for his first?
It's at the Fleury Battery.
Oh, is it the battery?
So he gets up into Vers-sur-Mer, as it is now, in the field next to the Normandy Memorial that was opened recently, are the casements. They still exist for the Fleury Battery. So Stan comes up there and somebody tips him off that there are some pillboxes that have not been cleared. So he advances towards them to go and have a look, at which point they fire at him. And without thinking, he grabs a Sten gun and charges, closes the ground, firing at the pillbox, and manages to get on top, grenade through the door, and he clears that pillbox. Then he moves down a communication trench to the second pillbox. They've seen what he's done, clearly don't want anything to do with him, so they more or less come out with their hands up. So he's cleared that position that could have enfiladed the entire company as it's moving forward. So that's the first action for which he's recommended for his Victoria Cross. Later in the day, at the village of Crépon.
If that wasn't enough.
If that isn't enough, he's tipped off that there's a German field gun in an orchard rhubarb patch in a farmhouse. He goes down, he attacks it with a piat. Surprise, surprise, the round falls short. But he's in there with two other guys, and Stan gets out and realises that the two guys are stuck in there. So he picks up a Bren gun, he charges into there, distracting the enemy so that his men can get out.
I like the fact that they crawl into the pumpkin patch, whatever it is. Yeah. He crawls out, leaves them, and then just runs back in.
Stan is always there, coming in on the landing craft. There's a couple of famous stories about Stan. One, the night before, Colonel Hastings gives him a packet of condoms and says, distribute these to the men. To which Stan obviously asks, are we fighting them or are we doing something else to them? And it has to be explained that these are for the Brens to keep them dry. But also coming in on the landing craft, he sees what he thinks is a German pillbox, picks up a light machine gun, gives it a full drum of ammunition. There is some dispute. Stan's own account is that he gives it a full drum of ammunition, and as he goes to lower it back to the landing craft, he grasps, and it turns out to be a World War I Lewis gun without a cooling sleeve, and he burns all the skin off his hand, and he described that as the worst wound that he'd had through the entire campaign. And funnily, when they get ashore, someone points out to Stan that it's actually a bus stop, or it's a tram stop, as it turned out. And the Green Howards have bought that tram stop. It's still there.
Oh, is it?
You can still see the bullet wound, the bullet marks in it, and it's the centre of events on Gold Beach every year on the 6th of June. There is so much that is still there that you can read the story and literally walk in those footsteps.
I know, but in a tram stop, I thought it might have gone.
No, it's still there. It's got the Green Howard flag. It's got the Green Howard information panel on it. Still there.
Hell of a shot to have hit it, and it's still there bobbing about, and he's under pressure.
Yeah, and it's funny, what guys do. We have a veteran called Ken Cook, who was in the 6th Battalion, who landed at the same time, and Ken will tell you that he's always asked, when the ramp came down, at that instant, what were you thinking? And Ken will tell you, the only thing I can remember thinking is I ran off through about 6 inches of water. He said, and as everybody else is barging past me, he said, the only thing I can remember thinking was, oh, for God's sake, look at the state of me feet. A human reaction in an inhuman situation.
Well, he's probably thinking I've got to have wet feet for the rest of the day. Exactly. And my ammunition boots won't be the most comfortable things with woolen socks to have wet feet.
So it's interesting when you get down to these stories at that level. And that's what we're going to bring forward in our exhibition next year, is that kind of thing. So Stan is that's his second action at Crépon, and it's for those two primarily that he's recommended for the Victoria Cross. Although there is a third action. There is a third action at a village called Christo, where again he takes out a German machine gun position that is threatening the flank of a company advance.
Is that the one in a sunken road?
It's up a sunken lane. Again, you can go there. It's all that. You can stand in the very position. But the thing that's interesting that Stan does, or the thing that tips him off, you or I would have walked past this, I'm sure. Stan hears a dog bark and thinks, why is that dog barking? Yeah. You or I say we'd just walk past. Stan has got enough about him to wonder why that dog is barking. And when he goes and has a look, he sees it, and the Germans are popping up. Fire, drop, pop up, fire. So he waits until they drop. And what Stan does is, again, he charges the position, throws a hand grenade, which he realises as it's arcing through the air, he's forgot to take the pin out of. But luckily the Germans don't know this, so panic ensues, and he clears that position.
Max Hastings introduced me to this quote with which is from his colonel. I think Hollis was the only man I ever met between 1939 and 45 who felt that winning the war was his personal responsibility. It's such a wonderful quote.
And I think his personal responsibility for winning the war was to take his lads home alive. You know, I often, when I'm around Middlesbrough or wherever, I often think, how many people are walking past me now who are here because Stan Hollis saved the life of somebody, and they're walking the streets now.
Stood up and did something extraordinary. Now, the Green Howards actually had quite a good day on that first, didn't they? Get inland further than anyone else.
We believe, and we are proudly boasting, that they are the furthest inland of any Allied unit. Their objective was to cut the Bayeux Caen road, and they're just short of that.
That's good going.
It's not bad. But again, you breaking through the crust was a lot easier than what was coming once the Germans had organised their defence. And that's the story of the Green Howards going on from there. There's days of, we move 5 miles, we're not really doing much, but then there's a massively intense fight where we take a lot of casualties for a few hours. It's that kind of move, fight, and it's gradually wearing out those numbers.
Yes. But Stan, so his war doesn't go much further than that, does it?
He's then wounded, blast and shrapnel injuries, and evacuated back to the UK for recovery and recuperation. And he's at home when he gets a telegram from somebody in the regiment to CSM Stanley Hollis, VC. Congratulations on the award. He knows nothing about this. He's not been officially told at this point.
Is he wounded 5 or 6 times, isn't he? He is a bit of a bullet magnet. I suspect many of those lads who went through the war like he did attracted them. Yeah,
absolutely. And malaria is also something he suffered with for quite a while. But there are guys like it. And again, in this museum, wonderful accounts of people charging headlong into Kenneth Nash at a place called Mount Pancali in Sicily, 7th Battalion, and he confesses in his own account, I lost it. The adrenaline kicked in and I just lost, and I'm charging forward. I turn around, there's nobody with me. He said, they're great, the Green Howards. I said, come on, Green Howards, forward. And I just heard this voice, so, go on, sir, we're right behind you. But sometimes, my family experience, my dad served with the Scots Greys in the Second World War, and he would watch a documentary where an old boy would perhaps be in tears about his experience, and my father would get angry.
Really?
Because my dad would say, but I had a great time. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. My dad liked fighting, and someone gave him a legit reason to do it. And the army needs people like that as much as it needs Stan Hollises of this world.
I have an uncle who served with the RAF as a bomb aimer, and he did multiple tours, and he loved it. Yeah. There was no LMF for him. He absolutely, and if you could get him talking about the war, his wife would get annoyed because she got sick of hearing about it. But John would tell you all about the war endlessly, and before long, he'd have all his photographs out. He'd go, I bombed everywhere. Look, that's Berlin, that's Dresden. And he had bombed absolutely everywhere, and he had the photographs, his aerial photographs that he'd taken of the ops, and he'd loved it. Whereas I think my dad had a very boring war, Royal Army Service Corps, and felt he hadn't done much. It's not he didn't like talking about it, he just felt he hadn't done much.
And again, if Stan was sat here, he'd say, I didn't. That's again another characteristic of men who've done this, is that, well, I just did what I did. It's, don't make me out to be different. Because again, if you look around the medal room here, there's 4,500 medals on display in this museum. Endless, not endless, but there are a number of military cross and bar. What have you got to do to get a VC?
Yes.
And that's the iniquity sometimes. And I'm sure, again, from what I know of Stan, and obviously I never met the man, but what I know of Stan, he'd say, it's unfair that I got that and he didn't.
What's remarkable about Stan is, though, he has 2 recommendations. It's amazing he didn't get 2 on the same day.
Well, he was recommended. I've seen reference to recommending for a Distinguished Conduct Medal in Sicily, which was translated somehow into a mention in dispatches. But again, the paper trail of that is not as clear as it perhaps could be. But certainly, the only Victoria Cross awarded at D-Day sits on display here in the Green Howards Museum in Richmond.
Considering how many men are involved on that one crucial day, and only one man gets it.
Only one man gets it. And it is that, the almost arbitrary nature of it. that who else did so much more, or
Yeah.
at least equalled it, and either nobody witnessed it, the witnesses didn't survive, whatever. On the 6th of June 2024, we have a full day of events which will culminate in the Hollis VC group coming out for people to have a look at and get up close and personal with. Hollis naturally casts a long shadow, but there are so many stories underneath there that we, this time, would like to bring forward as well, which I'm absolutely convinced Stan would say I'm bloody right too.
No, yeah, were there other notable Green Howard medals on that day?
We've got a plethora of DCMs.
Is there?
Yeah.
You never hear about them, do you?
No, well, this is what we want to do, you know. We've got stretcher bearers getting DCMs.
So you're starting at 6:30, aren't you?
Yeah,
in the
starting
morning.
at 6:30 with a memorial, with a service at the Green Howard Memorial here. We'll come back to the museum. We'll have breakfast. We'll have a tour of the museum and the collection behind the scenes as well. We'll have me doing a talk about the 6th and 7th Battalion on D-Day, down into some detail. We'll hopefully have some descendants and relatives of men who were there. Can't announce those just yet because we've got to tie a few things off, but possibly a descendant of Stan's who tells a fantastic story that one day he was going out for a dinner and they used to keep them in a button box, yeah, with the milk tokens for when the milkman came round, and they weren't there and they couldn't find them, and Stan couldn't go to this dinner because he didn't have them, and it turned out his daughter had put them on her nightdress and was marching around the house being a soldier, and had then gone to bed, turned over in the night and got up next day, and they turned the house upside down looking for the medals, and they were in the bed.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. That's just the blaseness of it, isn't
That's it. And those that kind of, it's almost social history as much as it's military in terms of all of that.
I always tend to think that's more interesting.
I'm a great believer you can't take one without the other. You've got to put that in the social context of its time.
Yeah.
It just tells you why a man or a woman enlisted anywhere.
Doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
How they're treating, why they're writing home asking for cake.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Don't send any meat pies. I just want cake. Was my great grandfather.
I've got another fantastic. We've got an account by a guy called Tom Tateson, who's a private in the 7th Battalion, and he's captured in Normandy. So you've got all of his, and then he becomes a POW, and the Germans send him down to a holding camp before he goes to Germany, and he's sent to work in a German field hospital, looking after casualties from Normandy. And he says on this particular day, he was told to look after a very stern SS officer who'd lost both his arms. And he said this officer made it clear that he needed to use the potty. So Tom says, right, okay. So I got it, lifted him on it, and he did what he needed to do. He said, now I suddenly thought, I need some toilet paper. He said, now I looked around, I couldn't see anything, but there was a newspaper on the chair. He said, and I picked it up. He said, and I realised I picked it up. The front cover was a big portrait of Hitler. He said, so I held it up to the German officer and made clear, can I use this? He said, and he very surreptitiously looked round him to see if anybody was near, smiled and nodded. And Tom said, I cleaned him up while both of us were in fits of giggles. I mean, that's just gold, absolute gold for our exhibition.
That's brilliant,
Isn't it?
That is brilliant. When's the exhibition open?
It'll open towards the end of May. It's astonishing because obviously the 80th anniversary is in people's consciousness. We've got people ringing us up and saying, I think my relative. And then when we look, they're the son of the guy who won an MC on the beach.
And they've been, for the families forgotten.
Yeah, and they're lending us stuff for the exhibition.
Well, I was going to say when you shake how much sort of starts coming out of the tree. Because in some respects, people don't move far.
That's right.
But at the same time, as you pointed out, this isn't necessarily a Yorkshire regiment when you look at those men inside it.
Those other things, we've been contacted. One of the things I always had was, if we can find the number of the landing craft, wouldn't it be great if there was an oral history in the Imperial War Museum of the guy who piloted it?
Yeah.
What's the chances? Never going to find it. Somebody emailed. My father was the coxswain of the landing craft taking them into Gold Beach. Absolute joy in heaven. Come on.
That's incredible.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Absolutely incredible. And then we've got again, as a D-Day story, the 10th Battalion of the Green Howards was converted to be a parachute regiment. It became the 12th Yorkshire Parachute Regiment, and it dropped at Ranville. Everybody focuses on Pegasus, absolutely right. But Ranville was the left-hand side of the entire operation. That blocked any German counterattack.
Yeah. Isn't that a big misdrop or on the wrong one?
No, there's misdrops. This one is relatively good. They get on the target and they capture it relatively quickly. But again, some of these guys who've never been on an aeroplane, 8 months before they're dropping at D-Day. There's a great story. One of these guys, they do their training at what is now Manchester Airport. Ringway, that's where they go from.
Yes.
And he said we're on the hard stand waiting for the aircraft to come and get us. We've all been issued with a pack of a parachute. No one's paying much attention. And I suddenly look down and I see the word dummy written on and I'm thinking, do I say something or do I can't lose face in front of the lads. He said, so I got on the plane. He said, and we hooked up. He said, I didn't know if it was going to work. Now, clearly, because he's telling the story, it did. But it gives you a kind of insight into these crazy people that were getting up there. And I don't know if it's going to work. He said, it's getting higher and higher, this aircraft.
So were they all volunteers?
Yeah.
Or were they voluntarily conscripted?
Voluntarily conscripted. It was announced in June 1943, tomorrow you're all going to be paratroopers. Who does not want to be a paratrooper? And only one man stood up. We have another battalion, 12th Battalion, again raised as infantry, become 161 Reconnaissance Regiment. And that's, again, I think, an unheralded role. Someone famously described it as Germans in front, everybody else behind.
Well, I was going to say, are they just pushing out? Are they a light infantry regiment just on?
Yeah, they actually are sent because the 43rd Wessex reconnaissance unit is absolutely decimated. So they're out there as replacements for that.
Through Normandy?
Yeah. So we've got a real range of different roles, all connected to the Green Howards one way or another, as well as fantastic individuals.
So how many battalions, remind me, how many battalions landed on D-Day, the Green Howards?
Two.
And how many were in Normandy by September, October?
We'd have four, I think. We'd have 4, 5, 6 and 7.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stories there to pick through.
Absolutely.
And then you've got men who'll obviously been cycled in back in.
Later in next year, we're going to cover from Normandy to the Elbe, which covers a lot of the fighting in Holland, which again is relatively untouched. We've got some fantastic connections.
Fighting in Holland that's not...
It's not Arnhem.
That's what I meant. It's not Operation Market Garden.
Yeah. So it's kind of under the radar a little. And we've got fantastic... There's a guy in Holland who's trying to get an identity on a headstone that he thinks is a Green Howard. It's currently an unknown British soldier. So, there's a lot we can cover.
Did the Green Howards cross the Rhine?
Not as a unit.
Not as
a homogenous unit. I think we had people who were seconded.
To be fair, they've probably had enough by the time it gets to the Rhine.
Yeah. But they're becoming much more effective troops as a consequence of that experience. But still, watered down is not the expression I don't want. They're still getting those replacements that are not affecting the operational effectiveness. Despite all of that watering down of the identity, the Green Howards signal that we have cleared our beach obstacles is received 49 minutes after a boot hits the sand on Normandy. Brilliant. That's not bad, considering you've never done something on that scale before.
When you look back now, the problem we have is the narrative of D-Day is often overlooked by the problems of Omaha. Yeah. So we think that everyone's pinned to the beaches, and the British beach experience, of which there are more... and they're a larger area, is eclectic, but it's a very different experience. And so 80 years later, we just think everything is people stuck to beaches. And actually, there is hard fighting, but we do, elements do move on, some don't.
Yeah. And just to give an indicator of the scale of stuff that's flying around there, I read an archaeological report that said the sand on Gold Beach, 4% of it is metal.
Really?
Either stuff that went bang, stuff that's rusting on the seabed and it's been washed ashore. 4% is metal.
God, that's incredible.
Absolutely. Now, what does that mean in terms of what was happening at that time?
Yeah, and stuff that's... I guess there's the whole bulk of stuff coming ashore as well, just masses of masses of...
The scale of it beggars belief.
Yeah.
And it is almost that scene from The Longest Day where the German officer is on the phone and the mist clears and he sees all those ships coming towards him. And he screams down the telephone, those 5,000 ships they say you didn't have? They've got them.
They're here. Well, I had a question about The Longest Day, and I did mean to watch it. Stan's not in it, is he?
No. But what's interesting is we've discovered a guy who was with the 6th Battalion, and Cornelius Ryan wrote to him and sent him a questionnaire.
Really?
And again, to show you the kind of thing that happens, we found a copy of that questionnaire in a university in Ohio, America, who have Cornelius Ryan's papers. So we can say, legitimately, that there is a Green Howard who had an influence on the making of the longest day.
But it's funny, though, that the only Victoria Cross winner doesn't get a mention. In a 4-hour film, whatever. I would like it's a tremendously long film.
Yeah. Now, whether or not, I don't know whether or not they did film it and it made the cutting room floor or whatever.
Now, what does Stan do after the Second World War?
So
well, no, not after the Second World War. I presume when you win the VC, you don't go back into combat?
He didn't go back into combat, no.
So he remained in the army then?
He remained in the army until he was demobbed, and then he went back to being an ordinary Joe. He was a lorry driver, he was a mechanic, he worked at the steel mills in and around Middlesbrough, and then he became a publican. His first pub was originally called the Albion in North Ormsby, which then became the Green Howard. And sadly, he died in 1972 at the age of, 59, just shy of his 60th birthday.
He said, I didn't clock his age. His death.
I think, the Blackwater fever and all of that, the malaria, the stress, whatever.
Been shot 67 times.
Yeah. Blast injuries.
No doubt everyone was heavily smoking.
Absolutely,
These things take their toll. I don't think his pub's been pulled down, hasn't it?
It's not there now any longer, no. There is now a pub in Crepon where was the scene of his second action. The French have renamed that bar in Crepon
Really?
the Green Howard. Yeah. And I could tell you a few stories about some nights in there, but I won't.
Well, Steve, we'll pause it there. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Steve Erskine, and we're looking at the Green Howards and Stan Hollis. It's all very well you celebrating the 80th anniversary of the Green Howards at D-Day. So what are you doing with those lot in Burma next year?
Well, again, we will. We've got, if this is a successful thing with Stan Hollis's VC group, we may do the same thing in August, because we have Private Henry Tandy, the most decorated private rank of the First World War. He's got a Victoria Cross, a DCM, MM, and mentioned in dispatches. Come on.
Right, so what? Hang on. So what's his? When does he win his VC?
He wins his VC in 1918.
Is that in the final?
Yeah. Mark Coing, I think, is
the
the name.
Last 100 days, or whatever it is. Right. Finest high point of the British Army that we've all forgotten about.
Absolutely, that we never give them credit for.
We never give them credit for.
All that learning curve, if you want to use that expression, it's a bit hackneyed now, but everything came together. All arms combat, logistics, aircraft, communications on the battlefield led to the greatest series of victories the British Army has ever achieved.
And all we do when we talk about the First World War is the Somme.
And the Second World War is somewhat like that, Again, no one mentions the 1st Battalion in Norway turning up for a campaign with skis and no straps to put them on your boots. This is Lord Dannatt, who was a Green Howard, and his book, Victory to Defeat.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, again, it is a testimony to the fact that despite public perception, the British Army did try and learn, and there were various things that may have stopped that, but they did try and learn. Again, you go through a lot of the First World War record, the after-action reports, saying, right, we thought we were going to do this is what happened, we need to learn these lessons. And the Second World War is very much like that.
Yeah. Because there is a sizable contingent in the Far East with SEAC, isn't there?
Yeah, we had the 2nd Battalion were in India for most of the Second World War, and they went to Burma in 1944. Again, a unit that's it's been in the plains of India, and it's sent to the jungles of Burma.
So it's the 2nd Battalion that my great-uncle Jacobean was it?
That will be it, yeah.
Family history has that he had a Burmese wife, but we're not completely sure. We're not sure if he didn't just fall out with his family because he didn't speak to his family most of the time, so we know very, very little about him.
It is a fascinating thing. Again, what we've done, we've done everything here from identify a skeleton on the Somme and to give that man a grave through using the archive here. The famous one I remember, family history, sometimes we call it the who do you think you are syndrome. So they see the celebrity go into a library, turn the microfiche 3 times, and there's the entire story. And people, a bit puzzled that we can't do that. But I was asked, can you tell me about my grandfather? He fought in the First World War. Normally the first question I have to ask is, do you want to tell me what his name was? And she gave me his name, and it was John Smith. And I said, you've got to give me something to work with. She said, all right. He was short and missing a finger. But the lady from Middlesbrough, 62 years old, my father, Green Howard, prisoner of war. We have the entire Red Cross collection for POWs here. And I found him. He's gone straight to a prison camp in Germany. If he'd been captured in the desert, he'd have gone to Italy first. So I'm assuming at this point, before I do a great deal of work, it's either Norway or Dunkirk where he's captured. But it's the first half of 1940. I tell her this and she says, no, that's not my father then. Why do you say that? Because I wasn't born till 1943.
Ah.
Yeah. You know where this is going. The man, she did a family history, and the man she'd regarded for 62 years as her father was not her father.
How bizarre. That is a good who do you think you are?
And when I spoke to her later on, I said, come on then, what do you think of him now? She said, I've racked my brains. I got the same cuddles, the same sweets, the same telling off as every other kid in the family. She said, but the astonishing thing is I've gone round and told people, and 2 of my cousins have said, did you not know?
Just doesn't get spoke about.
It's not that we're embarrassed by it. We just didn't think, we thought you knew.
Yeah. It just is what
that
it is.
British thing that we don't talk. Well, yeah.
It's not a thing.
It's not a thing. We just didn't think, we thought you knew. So I can't tell you the number of places. Remember what I said earlier about Steve getting easily distracted?
Yeah.
That's where this job can take you. It's fascinating.
Well, that's when you start scratching it. It's usually the ones that you can't find that they take your time because you become determined and bloody-minded. I'm going to find out who the hell you are.
Yeah.
And
Why can't I find this guy? He must be here somewhere.
And I've done this with First World War because half the battle is that most of them just aren't there.
Well, a lot of them.
But if you go prisoner of war, it's kind of prisoner of war and wounded. Brilliant.
Absolutely. You've got a starting point. You can move out from there. A lot of the time, because of these things are transposed, so you get an electronic record, they just have to spell the name incorrectly.
Yeah.
And suddenly you can't find that guy. You know he's there, but you have to sit and get creative of how you spell the surname, and suddenly there's the record.
Or he's decided not to use his first name on the form. Great. But he didn't use it on that form, or he was just T. Watkins on one form, but he was Thomas on another, and is that the same one?
Exactly.
I'm not sure.
And because a lot of this is the old copperplate writing, it looks like that, so I'll put that in.
Brilliant stuff.
So, fascinating stories. But D-Day, we've got so much material here that we can tell the story through, and I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to put that on and share. And again, if people are listening to this, if you've got a D-Day story, particularly if it's a Green Howard, please come and share that with us, because you just don't know where that's going to end up.
No, you don't know where it's going to lead.
Because we've got a physical exhibition and an online exhibition. Yep. And the online one, obviously, we can refresh with new stories as and when they come in. So please.
And then a series of talks.
We've got talk on, as I say, the Yorkshiremen that fell from the sky at Ranville. We've got the Reconnaissance Regiment. We've got a talk specifically about the making of a Victoria Cross, how they're awarded, some of the stories around that. Our website has a complete list of the events that are on. We're doing a couple of family history workshops as well that people can drop in on, and we can see if we can help you get to some detail of why you've got that piece of paper with a name on you don't recognise. Because again, we get that. We get medals offered here every week.
Yeah.
And we love them because you've got a name and you can do that research behind the stories. And it never ceases to amaze where it can take you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Steve, and telling us about Stan Hollis and the Green Howards. Loyal listener, you can find the Green Howards website at greenhowards.org.uk. I'll put a link to the museum's D-Day event in the show notes and on the website. I've already booked my ticket, so perhaps I'll see you there. The museum itself is in Richmond in the Yorkshire Dales, so if you are in the area, I would encourage you to have a look around. With Richmond Castle, it does make for a great day out. So that's all from me. For now, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.